Somewhere in the pages of old cookbooks, a different America still lives. A time when kitchens followed the trusted voice of Betty Crocker, and families gathered around dishes that now feel almost forgotten. These weren't just recipes, they were reflections of war, thrift, celebration, and quiet everyday survival. But somehow, many of them disappeared from our tables. Tonight, we're opening that lost chapter again, uncovering 10 creations that once defined a generation, and asking one simple question: why did we stop making them at all? Let the past return slowly, one forgotten bite at a time, and listen closely now. Tomato aspic. There was a time when dinner tables held something that today feels almost unrecognizable. It shimmered under the kitchen light, molded perfectly, carrying within it a quiet confidence. This was tomato aspic, a dish once proudly featured in the pages of Betty Crocker cookbooks, and served at gatherings where presentation mattered just as much as taste. At first glance, it seems unusual. A savory gelatin made from tomato juice, lightly seasoned with vinegar, celery, and spices, then chilled until firm. Sometimes, small vegetables were suspended inside, like a frozen moment of a summer garden. But in the 1940s and 1950s, this wasn't strange. It was elegant. It represented control, creativity, and a kind of culinary artistry that defined the era. To understand tomato aspic, you have to understand the time it came from. America was stepping out of hardship. Families wanted dishes that felt refined yet affordable. Gelatin became a symbol of modern cooking, a new technology that allowed home cooks to experiment in ways previous generations could not. And so, recipes like this spread quickly, appearing at church socials, holiday dinners, and formal luncheons. But something changed. As decades passed, tastes shifted toward warmth and comfort. Cold, molded dishes began to feel distant, almost unsettling to newer generations. What was once admired for its precision slowly became a curiosity, then a memory. Yet there's something haunting about its disappearance. Tomato aspic wasn't just food. It was a snapshot of ambition, of a culture trying to redefine itself through the simplest ingredients. And now, it sits quietly in forgotten pages, waiting to be remembered again. Chicken a la king. There was once a dish that defined comfort in its most elegant form, a recipe that turned simple leftovers into something that felt almost luxurious. It was called chicken a la king, and for decades, it held a permanent place in the kitchens guided by Betty Crocker. Served over toast, rice, or flaky biscuits, it was rich with cream, tender chicken, mushrooms, and peppers. But this wasn't just a meal. It was a transformation. Leftover chicken, something ordinary, was reborn into a warm, velvety dish that felt worthy of a special occasion. In the 1950s, when families were rebuilding routines and traditions, this kind of recipe carried quiet importance. It appeared everywhere. Weeknight dinners, holiday leftovers, even small celebrations where effort mattered more than extravagance. There was something deeply reassuring about it. The gentle simmer of the sauce, the familiar aroma filling the kitchen, the way it brought everyone back to the table without needing to call twice. But over time, its richness became its downfall. As cooking trends shifted toward faster, lighter meals, dishes like chicken a la king began to feel heavy, almost too slow for a changing world. Convenience replaced patience. Flavor gave way to speed. And slowly, this once beloved recipe faded from everyday life. Still, if you look closely, its memory lingers. In the idea of making something beautiful from what remains. In the comfort of a warm, creamy bite on a cold evening. Chicken a la king wasn't just about taste. It was about resourcefulness, about care, about turning the ordinary into something that felt like home. Perfection salad. There was a time when something called perfection arrived not as a warm, comforting dish, but as a chilled, shimmering mold placed carefully at the center of the table. It was known as perfection salad, a recipe once proudly endorsed by Betty Crocker, and a creation that perfectly captured the optimism of early 20th century kitchens. At its core, it was simple. Shredded cabbage, carrots, and sometimes peppers, suspended inside a lightly sweetened lemon gelatin. Once chilled, it held its shape, sliced neatly, each piece revealing a cross-section of carefully arranged vegetables. To modern eyes, it feels unusual, even contradictory. A salad that jiggles, a combination of textures that doesn't quite belong together. But in its time, this was innovation. Around the 1910s and into the 1930s, gelatin was seen as a symbol of progress. It allowed home cooks to present food in ways that felt structured, artistic, almost futuristic. Perfection salad even won awards, praised not for indulgence, but for its balance of health, beauty, and efficiency. It often appeared at luncheons and formal gatherings, where presentation spoke as loudly as flavor. Serving it meant you understood the trends, that your kitchen was modern, your table refined. It was less about comfort and more about impression. Then, quietly, it disappeared. As decades passed, tastes shifted toward dishes that felt more natural, less engineered. The novelty faded, and what once symbolized perfection began to feel distant, even strange. Yet its story remains. Perfection salad reflects a moment when food became more than nourishment. It became design, control, and aspiration. And now, like many things once called perfect, it lingers only in memory, waiting to be understood again. Tunnel of fudge cake. Not every forgotten recipe faded quietly. Some disappeared despite once being wildly popular, almost legendary in their time. Tunnel of fudge cake was one of them, a dessert that rose to fame through the pages of Betty Crocker and quickly became a symbol of 1960s baking ambition. At first, it looked like an ordinary bundt cake. Dark, rich, and perfectly shaped. But the real surprise waited inside. When sliced, a soft, gooey center revealed itself, a molten ribbon of chocolate hidden within the cake. It felt indulgent, almost accidental, as if something had gone slightly wrong in the best possible way. And in truth, it had. The cake's iconic texture came from a specific ingredient that later became unavailable, making the original result difficult to recreate. Home bakers tried to imitate it, adjusting recipes, experimenting in their kitchens, but something was always just a little different. Over time, the original version slowly slipped away. During its peak, this cake wasn't just dessert. It was an experience. It appeared at gatherings where presentation mattered, where a single slice could spark conversation. It reflected a growing fascination with baking as both science and art, where precise measurements could produce something unexpectedly magical. But as baking trends evolved, convenience once again took over. Box mixes simplified the process, but also erased some of the mystery. The joy of discovering that hidden center became less common, replaced by predictable results. Still, the legend of tunnel of fudge cake remains. It represents a rare moment when imperfection created something unforgettable. A reminder that sometimes, the most memorable recipes are the ones that weren't entirely planned, and perhaps can never be perfectly repeated again. Salmon loaf. Long before convenience meant takeout boxes and frozen dinners, it meant something quieter, something built on necessity. In many homes, especially during harder decades, one dish appeared again and again with quiet reliability. It was salmon loaf, a humble creation often found in the well-worn pages of Betty Crocker. At its heart, the recipe was simple. Canned salmon mixed with breadcrumbs, eggs, and a few seasonings, then baked into a firm, sliceable loaf. It wasn't flashy. It didn't try to impress. But it served a purpose. It stretched ingredients, fed families, and turned something inexpensive into a complete meal. To understand its place, you have to look back to the Great Depression and the years that followed. Fresh meat wasn't always available, and when it wasn't always affordable. Canned goods became a lifeline, and recipes like salmon loaf were born out of that reality. It appeared on dinner tables not because it was loved in the traditional sense, but because it was dependable. And yet, over time, it became more than survival food. Families adapted it, added their own touches, served it with sauces or sides that made it feel complete. It carried a certain familiarity, the kind that didn't need praise because it was always there. But as prosperity returned and options expanded, dishes like this quietly faded. People moved toward fresh ingredients, quicker meals, and flavors that felt more exciting. Salmon loaf, once essential, became a reminder of a time many were eager to leave behind. Still, its story lingers. Not as a forgotten mistake, but as a symbol of resilience, of making do, and of finding nourishment even when choices were limited. Mock apple pie. Some recipes feel like illusions, creations that exist not because ingredients were available, but because they weren't. Mock apple pie is one of those quiet deceptions, a dish that appeared in the pages of Betty Crocker and puzzled anyone who encountered it for the first time. There were no apples in it, not a single slice. Instead, it relied on crushed crackers, usually Ritz, simmered with sugar, cinnamon, and lemon juice. Somehow, through a careful balance of flavor and texture, it mimicked the taste and appearance of real apple pie. To those who didn't know its secret, it was nearly indistinguishable. This recipe came from necessity. During the Great Depression and wartime shortages, fresh fruit wasn't always accessible. Families adapted. They learned to recreate familiar comforts using whatever they had on hand. Mock apple pie wasn't just clever, it was comforting in a time when comfort was hard to find. Serving it carried a strange kind of pride. It showed ingenuity, the ability to turn absence into something familiar. Children ate it believing it was the real thing, and for a moment, it was. The illusion wasn't meant to deceive, but to preserve a sense of normal life. But when abundance returned, the need for such inventions faded. Real apples became easy to find again, and the idea of replacing them with crackers began to feel unnecessary, even odd. Slowly, the recipe disappeared, no longer needed in a world that had moved on. Yet mock apple pie holds a quiet power. It reminds us that food is not always about ingredients, but about memory and feeling. And sometimes, what we create in times of scarcity carries more meaning than what we have in times of plenty. Ham banana hollandaise. If there was ever a dish that could make modern cooks blink in disbelief, it was ham banana hollandaise. Featured in the pages of Betty Crocker during the experimental 1950s, it was the culinary embodiment of a time when innovation and curiosity often overpowered conventional taste. At first glance, the idea feels strange. Sweet bananas wrapped in savory ham, then draped with a rich, buttery hollandaise sauce. Each bite delivered a curious mix of flavors, the saltiness of the ham, the softness of the banana, and the smooth, tangy richness of the sauce. It wasn't meant to be subtle, it was meant to surprise, challenge, and impress. To understand why this dish existed, we need to glimpse the era's kitchen culture. Post-war America saw housewives and home cooks experimenting with new ingredients made widely available through improved packaging and distribution. Bananas were exotic yet accessible, and hollandaise sauce represented refinement. Combining the two with ham was a statement. Kitchens were laboratories, and dinner plates were canvases. It often appeared at small gatherings, where hosts wanted to spark conversation. Imagine the quiet anticipation at the table, slices being served, and guests hesitating before taking that first bite. Some loved it immediately, others were skeptical, yet no one could deny the ingenuity behind it. But as tastes evolved, the world grew cautious. Bold combinations like ham banana hollandaise gradually vanished, replaced by simpler, safer dishes. People craved comfort over experimentation, and the adventurous spirit of mid-century kitchens slowly dimmed. Today, looking back, ham banana hollandaise is more than a quirky recipe. It's a relic of a bold culinary era, a reminder that food can surprise, challenge, and delight all at once, even if it doesn't last forever. It whispers the adventurousness of a time when the American kitchen dared to dream. 7-layer salad. There was a time when a dish could impress simply by its height, its colors, and the care with which it was assembled. 7-layer salad, A staple of mid-century gatherings and proudly featured in Betty Crocker cookbooks, was exactly that kind of recipe. This salad was a spectacle. In a tall glass bowl, layers of crisp lettuce, sweet peas, shredded cheese, hard-boiled eggs, crunchy bacon, tomatoes, and a creamy dressing stacked one atop another. Each layer was visible, creating a vibrant rainbow of textures and flavors. It wasn't just a salad, it was a centerpiece, a conversation starter, a testament to patience and precision. Its popularity soared in the 1950s and 1960s. Potlucks, holiday dinners, and church socials relied on this kind of dish to show skill without resorting to extravagance. The process of layering was almost meditative, each component carefully prepared, seasoned, and positioned. Families took pride not only in the taste but in the visual harmony of the salad. But as decades passed, tastes shifted toward simplicity and convenience. The painstaking layering became unnecessary in an era of faster meals, pre-packaged salads, and microwavable sides. 7-layer salads slowly vanished from everyday tables, remembered only in faded photographs and worn recipe cards. Yet its story is worth revisiting. More than a collection of ingredients, 7-layer salad reflects a moment when cooking was both practical and artistic. It celebrated community, gathering, and the small joys of a meal prepared with care. Even today, recreating it evokes nostalgia, a reminder of a time when food could be a performance, and the act of serving it was as important as eating it. In its layers, we find history, ambition, patience, and a longing to create beauty in the simplest of things. Impossible pie. Some recipes seem almost magical, appearing simple on the surface yet hiding a complexity that feels like a trick. Impossible pie, a creation celebrated in Betty Crocker cookbooks, was one such marvel. At first glance, it appeared as an ordinary pie with a perfectly formed crust and a golden, inviting filling. But the magic lay in the way it baked itself, the crust forming from the very filling as the pie cooked, without any separate preparation. The origins of impossible pie trace back to a time when home cooks valued ingenuity as much as flavor. In the 1960s and 1970s, convenience began to intertwine with creativity. Ingredients like sweetened condensed milk and simple pantry staples allowed a pie to transform itself, delivering something that looked complex but required little skill. Families marveled at the way it emerged from the oven. A smooth custard center, golden and set, with a perfectly self-formed crust, almost as if by magic. It became a fixture at Sunday dinners, church socials, and family celebrations, where presentation was prized as much as taste. Children were amazed, adults were impressed, and hosts felt a sense of accomplishment that came not from effort alone, but from the cleverness of the recipe. Yet, as culinary trends shifted toward fresher ingredients and more modern desserts, impossible pie began to fade. Its simplicity, once admired, felt outdated, its magic replaced by speed and convenience. People stopped baking it, and over time, the recipe slipped from memory. Today, impossible pie survives mostly in vintage cookbooks and nostalgic recollections. But it remains a reminder of a time when ingenuity ruled the kitchen, when food could surprise and delight without extravagance. In its golden, self-forming crust, we glimpse the creativity, optimism, and quiet wonder of mid-century American cooking. Vinegar pie. Sometimes, necessity breeds the most surprising culinary creations. Vinegar pie, a recipe that once appeared in the trusted pages of Betty Crocker, is a perfect example. At first mention, it sounds strange, pie made with vinegar? Yet, in an era defined by scarcity, especially during the Great Depression, this simple dessert became a symbol of resilience and ingenuity. The recipe was simple, a basic pastry crust filled with a custard made from sugar, eggs, a splash of vinegar, butter, and a hint of spice. The vinegar acted as a subtle tartness, balancing the sweetness and creating a flavor surprisingly reminiscent of a traditional fruit pie, even though no fruit was used. It was an elegant solution when apples, peaches, or berries were unavailable or unaffordable. Families turned to vinegar pie not just out of necessity but as a demonstration of resourcefulness. It appeared at kitchens across the country, quietly feeding households while also representing a shared cultural ingenuity. Mothers and grandmothers would serve it with a sense of quiet pride, knowing they had created something comforting from almost nothing. Over time, as prosperity returned and fresh produce became accessible once more, vinegar pie lost its place at the table. What was once ingenious began to feel outdated, its relevance replaced by fruit-filled desserts and newer trends. Yet, despite fading from everyday use, it remains a fascinating glimpse into the American spirit, a reminder that creativity and adaptability often shape the most memorable recipes. Today, vinegar pie endures as a testament to resilience. It tells a story of survival, resourcefulness, and subtle sophistication. Every bite whispers a history of hard times, of kitchens that never stopped trying, and of the quiet determination to make sweetness out of scarcity. Forgotten by many, yet unforgettable in its story, vinegar pie remains a small, remarkable piece of culinary history. These 10 recipes were more than just meals. They were reflections of their time, snapshots of families, communities, and kitchens that no longer exist. From the shimmering tomato aspic to the resilient vinegar pie, each dish carries a story of creativity, necessity, and nostalgia. While many have disappeared from modern tables, revisiting them reminds us of the ingenuity and heart that once defined American cooking. If you've enjoyed this journey through forgotten flavors, consider subscribing to join us as we uncover more lost recipes, preserving the tastes and tales that history almost forgot, one dish at a time.